begin. As we start, are there any urgent prayer requests or updates? I know the Thorpes are traveling, the Woods are still traveling. Betty's memorial was very nice on Friday, and family seemed to appreciate everybody being there. Let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Our Lord, Father in heaven, we thank you for the many ways that you have blessed us this day to be here and to study from your word together. We thank you, Lord, for the church as we learn about our relationship to it and to you. Ask that you will be with us and aid us in our understanding, and we can better demonstrate your love and your compassion and your pattern to those in this world. Lord, we ask that you go with us now in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so I mentioned last week that we're going to start off on maybe a little bit of a nerdy note, looking at some original languages, but as we're talking about being the people of God, the Greek word that's used there is laos. Laos. And it's where we have derived in English our word laity. However, unlike how we've basically in modern English, and especially in the Western world, we've corrupted the word. It has no meaning of a part or even a majority or anything of that nature. Laos just means people. And it stands almost exclusively for the whole, where in modern terms, we often have the difference between, for example, clergy and laity. And even I'm subject to that to some extent, because for the way that our government sees things, I have to register myself as a clergyman, even though I'm not a clergyman. That is, I'm not anything special as far as religiously. I'm not anything higher, more important, set apart in any way from anyone else in the church. But because I perform these duties, the government basically makes me recognize myself as such. And so we have this word, and it doesn't just apply to the clergy laity. There's also the term laity also is sometimes applied in other professions, doctors, lawyers, things of that nature. But like I said, the way that we use the term in English is corrupted from its actual meaning. It just means God's people. And so it is a chosen people, a people with a special status, but it is inclusive of everybody who holds that status. So there's no differentiation. And in fact, the term clergy itself comes from the idea that Peter presents in his writings in 1 Peter 5, when he talks about to his fellow elders to be watchful over those to whom they've been given charge. And so the term clergy comes from the Greek word kleron, which literally means to be in charge of, to have charge over. And so, again, the somewhat modern corruption, the term, if we were going to use the term clergy in a religious context, it would apply to elders, not to preachers. But again, the Bible doesn't even use the term clergy. There is no such thing in the Bible anywhere. It does use what we essentially derive as laity, but again, it means the entirety of God's people. And again, the emphasis that Peter and others make in the New Testament is that the important thing about the people is not anything like that. It's not about having special knowledge or special status, especially within the community. But the defining special status is that this people, this Laos belongs to God. It is his people. And in that sense, it's fully collective. As one brother put it, the ground at the base of the cross is flat. It means it doesn't matter if you are the newest of Christian that knows almost nothing about the Bible, or you're the 70-year veteran elder that could recite it almost entirely from memory. If you're in Jesus, and it's all the same. And I'm not saying that we should not have renown, and I'm not saying that we should not have respect for those that have put in the time and effort, but we just have to be careful that we don't allow the world's interpretation of some of these terms and the world's application of these things to color our approach. And specifically, Paul spends a lot of time in the book of Romans dealing with the division of God's people, but primarily the division he talks about is the self-imposed division between the Greeks and the Gentiles. But even there, he quotes from Hosea, he quotes from Isaiah, and his emphasis is that God was going to make a new people of people who were previously not a people. I mean, he was going to take, yes, he has Israel that were his people in the Old Testament and things, and up to the point of the cross, but then there's going to be a new people. And in fact, he even quotes from Isaiah talking about utilizing a nation that is not a nation to make Israel jealous. That is, God was going to call the Gentiles into the church in hopes that Israel would realize they've lost their status as God's Laos, and want to come back. Does that make sense? It's somewhat similar to how Jesus himself describes the idea of disfellowship. That the idea behind it is to have the person recognize what they've lost. It's not to impose some sort of penalty. It's not to be punitive necessarily, but it's to help that person to realize, oh, I had this relationship, I had these people who loved me and I was a part of something, and now I don't have that relationship anymore. God was doing the same thing with his previous people, showing them what they had lost by including the Gentiles and calling them to him. And I would say specifically in that, not calling them through Judaism to Christ, but directly to Christ. Does that make sense? Because again, when we look at the New Testament, especially the book of Acts and the book of Galatians, and I would say the book of Hebrews especially, there was this idea amongst a lot of Jewish believers that people had to at least become marginally Jewish before they could become Christians. That is, they didn't necessarily have to fully convert to Judaism, but remember, they're also, when you really look at it, it's kind of shocking how much time God, through Paul and others, spends, for example, saying that circumcision is not important for your salvation, or that dietary laws are no longer important for your salvation. Those types of things, because those are very physical defining factors for the Jewish people. So I understand why they might continue to feel important to them, but there was also, of course, that general misunderstanding of how it is that Christianity now operates, and it wasn't through those commands and instructions of the law. So, as another way of kind of distinguishing God's people, this personhood, this people, is only identified as a community. Why that's important is that so many people today have this kind of mistaken idea that A person can be a Christian without the church. But by and large, yes, Christianity is an individual endeavor in terms of salvation. That is, nobody can be baptized for you, nobody can have your faith for you, etc. But when it comes to God's people, it's always spoken of in this community setting. That is, it's not spoken of as an individual being God's people. It's always spoken of as the collective being God's people. Does that make sense? And as a people, we have a special place, because again, the nature of God's people has changed. As I mentioned, Wednesday night, Judaism was never sought conversion. That is, there is nowhere in the law that the Jewish people were ever told to go and try to convert the nations to Judaism. Judaism was a law for Israel, and in fact, Israel was all but forbidden from having any significant interactions with other nations. That is, they were not supposed to enter into treaties, they were not supposed to intermarry, they were not, they could trade with them and sell them things, they could loan money, and they could actually charge interest to a foreigner. They could charge interest to a fellow Israelite, but they could charge interest to a foreigner. But it was only in those kind of transactional interactions that Israel was supposed to exist with any of those other nations. Whereas now, as the church, not only are we the people of the covenant, Israel was a people of the covenant, right? They were the recipients of God's covenant. They enjoyed the blessings of the covenant. But now we are also the bearers of the message of covenant. So we are not simply we're not simply a people that is set apart by association, in the sense of we're not like the alumni of your high school or college, right? You're collected by association. But we're also not just transmitters of a message. We're not just a newspaper or something like that. We have this kind of combined role, and that is different from any other time in human history. Even the patriarchs, when we look at Abraham and others, they were not given a message of preaching to others. The only one that we could say that was Noah, but it wasn't really a message of conversion, right? It was just a message of save yourselves. They already, in Noah's day, should have all known who the real God was, and even though Noah preached, he only was able to convince his family. But again, not a message of conversion, not a message of change, from this to this, not a change from Judaism to Christianity or paganism to Christianity, but just a message of follow. And we could say the same thing for Abraham. God chose him because he knew he would teach his children God's ways, for example. But again, this connection to God as being recipients of the covenant, but also those, as Paul puts it in 1 Thessalonians, he says, we are those that are entrusted with the gospel. God has this message of reconciliation. He has this message of peoplehood. And we are charged with taking it to the people, to the nations. And so, again, this is the first time that God's people have been given this. We often refer to it as evangelical because that means to carry the good news literally. But, a missionary might be a better descriptor. Like I said, there have been something similar, but even Noah wasn't necessarily a missionary in going out and finding people, right? He was building the ark, and seemingly it was when the people came to him that he tried to convince them. Noah wasn't necessarily, as we're told to, as we go out to the world to try to bring them back with us, right? So even that's different. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now. We've kind of established this idea of being God's people and the fact that it is a communal idea and in the Bible exclusively communal. So let's talk about some other terms that are used of the church or of God's people, and some of their general significance. Okay, and the first of which would be spiritual Israel, or something along those terms. There's a couple different ways that it's worded in the New Testament, and it also can depend somewhat on your English translation of choice. But for example, in Romans chapter 9, if somebody could read Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 8, please.
But it is not as though the word of God has failed, for they are not all Israel, who are descended from Israel, nor are they all children because they are Abraham's descendants, but through Isaac your descendants will be named. That is, it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise are regarded as descendants. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So, here, again, Paul says, not all who are born of Israel are of Israel, right? Well, it doesn't mean literally, right? I can't call myself Israeli and I can't call myself Jewish by race unless I am literally born to those places and race, right? At least not yet. You can identify as whatever we want, but we can't change our race. But he's applying this spiritually. Even as he points out there in verse 7 that you can't just claim to be Abraham's descendants, because what other group of people would have the claim to be Abraham's descendants besides Israel?
The Ishmaelites.
Yeah, the Ishmaelites. Essentially, the foundations of what we know today as the Arab people. They also have a claim to parentage by Abraham. But Paul's point in making that comment about being born of Isaac is that it's about who receives the promise, not simply DNA and birth, right? And I think this kind of is a little bit difficult for us as Americans to understand. I don't know who's aware of this, but America is one of only a handful of nations in the world that you obtain citizenship by birth. Most other nations, even if you are born there, you have to apply for citizenship and prove that your newborn baby should be considered a citizen of that place. You have to apply for citizenship even if you are born. And so I think that kind of adjusts our ideas of some of these things. But what God is saying is that it doesn't matter where, to whom, or whatever you were born. It's about the promise, the covenant. And he's utilizing the idea of the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not Ishmael, not Esau. Right? It's the sons of promise, so to speak. Well, we are now the sons of promise, even as he says, it is not children of the flesh who are children of God, but children of the promise. And even Jesus himself, right, he makes that comment when the Pharisees say that, he says, don't say that you are the children of Abraham. He said, God could raise up from these stones descendants of Abraham. Jesus' point was, you're going to claim this divine right, this divine parentage, but you don't act like it, and so it doesn't really matter, right? Jesus' own point was, I can produce untold number of people who could trace their lineage all the way back to Abraham. That doesn't mean that they're acceptable to God, even from among Israel, right? We've been looking at in our Wednesday night class, we've been looking at some of those prophets that prophesied during the captivity. Why did they go into captivity? Because the majority of the nation, the vast majority of the nation, became unacceptable to God, even though their DNA didn't change, right? They were still Israelites. They were even still of the parentage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? But they failed to be the people of covenant. And now we don't even have that physical connection when it comes to our relationship with Jesus. It's all about being the people of covenant.
Well, just like a physical family, we may say today, my brother or my sister, they're whatever, and we'll say, they're not my brother. They're not my brother anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They've gone off into a different kind of lifestyle that is unacceptable to our family. They are not my brother anymore. We do that even today in family.
Yeah, families disown, people, and I would say on the other side of that, I have people that I call aunt and uncle that have no DNA connection, but because maybe when they were, younger, I do have one set of grandparents that seemingly ran a hospital, and when you look at how many people lived with them, worked for my grandfather at times to kind of, get their life kind of back in order. And again, I call those people my aunts and uncles because they have such a close relationship with, especially my mom and the family. But if you went on Ancestry.com, their little leaf isn't going to be hanging from the tree anymore, right? So and that's really what God is talking, or what God is talking about through Paul here in Romans 9, is that the people of God here, as he uses this term of, not physical Israel, but what we sometimes call spiritual Israel, it's about living up to the covenant. God has always been a God of covenant, but by and large, God's covenants are conditioned. And if we fail to meet the conditions, we are no longer the people of covenant. That's the warning, by the way, from a New Testament perspective, that's the warning of Revelation chapters 2 and 3, right? Those letters to the 7 churches of Asia. Almost all of those letters end with that warning that if they don't change, he will come and remove their lampstand. Meaning, he will cease. If they fail, let me finish the sentence. If they fail, he will cease to recognize them as his people. In the same way that some of these prophets that we've been looking at on Wednesday, we're going to, Lord willing, look at Hosea, and Paul, by the way, quotes Hosea right here in Romans 9, verse 25 and 26. But Hosea even speaks of this, of God seeing Israel as no longer his people, seeing Israel as no longer people of mercy, because they had essentially just become just as wicked and vile to him as the nations. God looked at Israel and saw nothing different about Israel and their behavior than what he saw when he looked at Egypt or Assyria or any of these other places. And then that's, again, the distinction here. If we want to be known as the spiritual Israel, if we want to be known as God's people, then we have to be representative of what God wants in his people. If we want the blessings of the covenant, we've got to abide by the covenant. We've got to act like God's people. And like I said, there are several different ways that this same idea. So this one's a little bit hard to say, oh, look for this phrase. But, there's the Israel of God, there is spiritual Israel. That here Paul refers to it as not Israel of the flesh, or children of the flesh, right? It's all giving us the same message, but he doesn't, there's not necessarily a standardized phrase that God uses in the New Testament. Unfortunately, I guess, because that always makes it easy, right? When you just can search for a single phrase. Okay, and this is one that comes from, the next one comes from 1 Peter chapter 2, and it is the term royal priesthood or priestly kingdom, depending on your translation. Of course, this is significant from the standpoint of its combination of terms. You could not be a royal priest in Judaism, not possible. Where was the ruling house from? What tribe?
Levi.
Judah. And prior to David, it was what tribe? Anybody remember what Saul?
Are you talking the priest?
The ruling, the kings.
Oh, okay.
What is it? Anybody remember what
Prior to David.
prior to David you had Saul, and he was from what tribe? Anybody remember?
No.
Benjamin.
Oh.
Okay. So, of course, the promise is given to David during his reign, and all subsequently his throne will be established forever, right? So we basically always associate the kings of Israel with Judah. But there was also Benjamin. But where do priests have to go? Levi. Okay. So the idea of having a royal priesthood is completely foreign to the idea of Judaism. Because you have to go back, and this is why the Hebrew writer uses he uses Melchizedek, who was a priest and the king of Salem during Abraham's time. Remember, that's before the law, so there wasn't that differentiation between ruling class. There wasn't even a nation of Israel, right? But that's also kind of telling, right? To go back and give us a physical representation of Jesus' position as both king and high priest, he has to go back before the law to somebody who's literally mentioned like 4 times in the entirety of the Old Testament. Because this is something completely foreign to the Jewish way of thinking. And I find it very interesting that it comes from Peter. Specifically, that Peter is the one that coins this phrase. And the reason I say that is because, number one, Peter is the one that first formally preached to the Gentiles, right? To Cornelius and his household. I say first formally did it because he's the first that we have recorded of it. And he's the one that really had to make a defense of his actions, which tells me that it had not become commonplace at that point in the church. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it certainly was not widely accepted.
And then he was also the one that tried to bind the Jewish customs on the Gentiles later.
And that was, yeah, and I say it, and then you have the book of Galatians where Paul talks about having to confront Peter because he wasn't necessarily refusing fellowship in the sense that he didn't see them as Christians. I think that's important, but he wouldn't eat with the Gentile Christians, and he wouldn't.
I think the King James uses the phrase carried away.
Yeah.
I think.
And well, it carried away, I want to say Titus or Timothy, I don't remember which, but Peter's actions were so blatant that it was causing other people to go, oh, well, if Peter's behaving this way, maybe I'm wrong in my association with these people. And Paul has to confront Peter and say, you are not only acting wrong, but you are influencing other people to act wrong also. And of course, that's a big deal. And so I find it especially telling that Peter, and this is what I love about Peter, is that you can see Peter grow as a person And Peter is a later writer, not as late as John, obviously, but he is a later writer. And you can see his personal approach has changed so much from, the the Peter who's, yelling and screaming, and the Peter who's denying Christ, or the Peter who is, getting out of the boat and then sinking, and, or the Peter who is denying the fellowship of Gentiles. And here he's talking about this royal priesthood. And there's going to be some things that we're going to touch back on some of these phrases in later studies, but just that designation alone is a way that God is making sure that that we understand that Christianity is not a part of, beholden to, derived from Judaism, even though we share a lot of similar things. Okay? Because again, Judaism has no room for a royal priesthood. It cannot exist in Judaism. And the same thing would apply for the modern day Jewish person, by the way. They could not, if they trace their lineage, and most people cannot, but if they were able to trace their lineage to, say, Judah, they can't be a priest. And if they trace their lineage to Levi, okay, you can be a priest, but you can't be a king. Because if you're saying, again, if you're going to deny Jesus as the Messiah, then you have to say those promises to David, for example, those promises to Levi, those are still in effect if you deny Jesus. And so, again, this idea of royal priesthood, distinctly different. Okay, also from that same passage in 1 Peter chapter 2, we have the holy nation. Now this is a phrase that is applied to Israel at times, that they are his holy nation. That is, they are a people of holiness, and their holiness is derived from their association with God, not because they were actually behaving in a holy manner. Okay, because we can see Israel right from before they even get to Sinai, Israel is misbehaving, right? Before they even reach Sinai, they're complaining, they want to go back, and then at the base of Sinai, while Moses is literally receiving the word of God, what do? They build an idol. Right? And so again, this is one of those things where, and this I think is demonstrated, or the misunderstanding of that term is demonstrated in the behavior of Israel. Okay, when you look at the people during, well, for example, the attacks of Nebuchadnezzar and the besieging of Jerusalem, they never thought God would allow the city, and especially never thought that the temple would ever be touched, because they're God's holy people. But God's point through all of those prophets, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, you're not acting holy, so you're not holy anymore. Even during the construction of the temple, during Ezra and Nehemiah's day, God has to correct them through Ezra and Nehemiah, because the people were behaving badly and then coming to build the temple. And he says, your sin is defiling the temple because you bring it with you. Saying essentially, by being this people of sin every night and then coming and touching the stones of my temple, you are defiling my temple. I'm not saying that because I'm saying, oh, all of Israel. No, because even as I mentioned, when I say men like Daniel, Ezekiel, and well, all of the prophets, but I mean, there are, to me, certain shining examples. Daniel is one of those. Elijah is one of those. Enoch is one of those, right? Anybody that God had such a strong and beautiful relationship with. Shining examples of people who were doing it right. So I don't want us to get this idea that everybody in Israel was so totally off base, but okay, when we think of Sodom and Gomorrah, what was the minimum level that God finally agreed to spare Sodom and Gomorrah? 10 people. 10 people in 5 cities. Now we focus on Sodom and Gomorrah, but there were actually 5 cities of the plain that were destroyed that way. In 5 different cities, including Lot's own family, there were not 10 people. And so the emphasis, the reason I make that emphasis is that even with amazing people like Daniel, like Jeremiah, like Isaiah, like Elijah and others, if you've got such a small percentage, there comes a point when God just cannot ignore that overwhelming lifestyle of the people, right? And so this term of holy nation also carries over into the New Testament, of course, by Peter. But we could also look at the book of Hebrews, talks a lot about the holiness of God and how it's applied to us. I also find it interesting that Peter is also the one that quotes Leviticus saying, "Be ye holy as I am." Peter had a lot to say on the idea of holiness and being holy, but the holiness, even in that quotation from Leviticus, "Be holy as he is holy." We don't derive holiness, we receive holiness. That is, we can't go out and mine it, we can't dig a well and pull it up with a bucket. Oh, look, it's holiness. It has to just be given to us by God, and we get it by behaving according to his covenant. He bestows upon us that holiness. And so it takes on a special meaning, of course, for us because Christianity isn't a nation in the sense of having borders, a physical address, and things of that nature. We are a nation of varied origin. I guess that's the way I want to put it. But just as an example, today, across the world, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of churches gathered just like this today, right? They're all part of that nation. Regardless of where they are on the globe, regardless of what language they speak, regardless of so many of those deciding factors that especially in our modern world, we somewhat obsess over those distinctive things. And I think that's especially obvious in years like this one where we have the Olympics, things like that, right? Because there's so much talk about, there's so much talk about being one world, and then the Olympics come along and it's USA, right? There's so much talk about how we need to have, whether you talk about the UN or something, but we need to have this kind of unified governance across all of the earth, and then all of a sudden the Olympics come along and, oh, you're not from China, you're not from Ukraine, you're not from Zimbabwe, and it's, right? So much so even that even stars or star athletes will sometimes go compete for their homeland, even though maybe professionally they operate within the United States, right? And again, it's just kind of some of those different things, but here we are, this nation, and our unification does not come because of DNA, does not come because of location, it comes because of our connection to God and his holiness. And so, even though this term is used in the Old Testament to talk of Israel, it's certainly not spoken of in the same way that it is of Christianity and Christians. Okay, another term that is used heavily, especially in the prophets of the Old Testament, is the righteous remnant. The righteous remnant. And this was spoken of by Isaiah and Jeremiah. No. If there was a unifying theme to the prophets, it's the remnant. It is the fact that God says over and over and over again that he will spare Israel, but it's only going to be a remnant. What he means by that is there's going to be a lot of people and a lot of people did lose their lives in first Assyria's destruction of the northern kingdoms, and then in Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon's destruction of all of Israel. A lot of Jewish people lost their lives. Some were taken into captivity, some were thrown out into various nations, right? They were dispersed. And only a portion came back. Some of that was, of course, by choice to some extent. That is, it was actually never commanded that they had to go back, and history and things tell us that not everybody that maybe could have did return to Israel. But the numbers that did return, for example, as I mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah, there was a struggle in having enough people outside of the city of Jerusalem to actually defend these different cities, defend even the city of Jerusalem itself if it was to come under attack, because there were so few people even in the surrounding area that if they put up the war cry, if they blew the trumpets, they could not expect a massive number of people to come running to the city to help defend it. That's how few people came back, even when they could, under Cyrus and Darius. And so God speaks of this righteous remnant. But here again in Romans chapter 9, Paul quotes from Isaiah in chapter 9 and verse 27 of this remnant. And here Paul is applying it to the number of Jewish people who believed in Jesus. Because again, a relatively small number. And I think it is important for us to realize that a lot of people, I think, I don't know where this is. It was not a small thing that 3,000 people came forward. Not a small thing that 3,000 people were baptized on the day of Pentecost. But when you're talking about the fact that the city of Jerusalem was probably playing host to 3 or 4 million people that day, kind of puts it in perspective. Okay? And we have to remember that. Jesus himself said that the church was always, and his holy nation it was always going to be small in number. Right? What are the 2 roads? The small and narrow, and you find it, and the wide and easy that most people go down. Well, by definition, few and most are designations of amount, right? The church is always going to be on the few side. Because even Jesus knew that not everybody was going to make that choice. Because, well, who is a better expert on human psychology and human behavior than God himself, right? And of course, he had 1,500 years of data dealing with Israel. And knowing that even amongst the nation who was given so many blessings and so many opportunities, only a few really lived up to the standard, so to speak. Okay, we're out of time for this morning. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the remnant, and we've got one more term, and then we're going to start talking about election, what that means to be chosen because there are some very unfortunate terms that are used incorrectly, especially in modern Christianity. So I think we certainly it's worth some time talking about how it is that God, the mechanism that God uses for choosing. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.